Emily Poole. Let's talk all about absolutist approaches to power. Absolutism is a governmental system where one person has absolute power. Let's not overthink this. It is concomitant with, it often goes hand in hand with this idea of divine right, which says that I am on the throne because God has placed me on the throne. Supported by writers like Bousset, this idea of divine right justifies leaders' right to rule. But absolute monarchs can't just do whatever they want to. There are actually 4 specific ways that they gain and consolidate their power. Number 1 is that they often regulate religion. If we're looking at Louis XIV, Louis XIV said, one king, one law, one faith. He revokes the Edict of Nantes and replaces it with the Edict of Fontainebleau, which says that if you are going to be French, you are going to be Catholic, which then leads hundreds of thousands of Huguenots to flee France to go to more Protestant-friendly lands like Prussia or like the Dutch Republic. Number 2, absolute monarchs actually have to cooperate with the nobility because they realize that the nobility are the people who are keeping them in power. And in order to stay in power, you need to make sure that you have those people on your side. Louis XIV hosted lavish parties at Versailles and made a ton of fun, fashionable changes. Yes, in order to keep an eye on the nobility to make sure that they wouldn't overthrow him. Again, that's going back to the idea that he had to contend with the Fronde in his youth, but also to make sure that they were happy and that they were placated, because if the nobility is mad, they're going to want to do something about it against the monarch. This is maybe the most important thing that absolutes did in order to keep their power. They are limiting the nobility's participation in government, but they are supporting those aristocratic social and economic privileges. Number 3, they established permanent armies. These are now standing armies that can exist for the benefit of the state, like to quell internal conflict, but also to then maybe conquer nearby lands, or with like a little show of force, be like, hey, Europe, I'm a state worth contending. And number 4, in some cases, these monarchs utilized secret police forces. Looking at you, Ivan in Russia. Now, the AP test actually only wants you to know about 2 of these absolute monarchs in this topic, and they are Louis XIV and Peter I. Ah, Louis XIV, l'état c'est moi. We all love him so much, but you know who doesn't always get enough credit for supporting that lifestyle? His finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Jean-Baptiste Colbert says, if it can be made in France, make it in France. He is limiting imports from other countries in order to maximize exports from France. And Louis and Jean-Baptiste Colbert together spend a lot of their time developing fashion, which I love, because let's just consider the fact that Louis, at his heart, in his inner core, was a ballet kid, a theater kid, and then what does he do in his adult life? He popularizes French fashion so that still today, in this year, France is the fashion capital of the world. Jean-Baptiste Colbert was the guy who came up with the idea of we need a summer wardrobe and we need a winter wardrobe. And Louis took this idea of local, handmade French things so far that when he saw his son wearing a wool coat from England, he ordered him to burn it. So while Louis is ascending his nobility and aristocratic class up here with fancy fashion and fancy parties, the rest of the Third Estate, not doing great, but that will become more important next unit. So Jean-Baptiste Colbert comes up with brilliant ways to make France as much money as possible, but here's the problem. The more money that Colbert brings in, the more money that Louis spends on wars that he tends to lose. I gotta say, even though the Dutch Revolt and the 9 Years' War cost a lot of money, Louis still has so much because Versailles cost $2 billion in today's money to build. Just a reminder, Versailles is a monumental work of architecture that shows off the glories and the splendor and the wealth of France under Louis XIV. So that is us looking at absolutism in the West, but now let's look at absolutism in the East under Peter I. Peter I is sometimes called Peter the Great, and students, I personally, as a teacher, hate to talk about leaders as the great or the terrible, and here is why. History exists in the gray area. If we see things as good or bad or great or terrible, then we tend to only view them through that lens. If I'm telling you that Peter is the great, and great as a connotation is good in our society, then you're only going to see the good things that Peter did and not the bad things that he did. People are good and bad, not good or bad. Peter I became leader in Russia in the mid-1600s and saw that Russia was really far behind its contemporaneous European counterparts. It also helps that he spent a lot of his time traveling to Western Europe in his youth, and he noticed, wow, look at these ships. Look at these modern cities. Look at all these people who are dressed very fancily. When he becomes the sole Tsar of Russia, he takes it upon himself to westernize this backwoods country. Politically, he builds his new capital, St. Petersburg, which he calls his window on the West. Yes, because it is a warm water port that kind of overlooks Western Europe, but also because he models the city after France. Speaking of a new warm water port, Peter builds a navy from scratch and then also reinvigorates the Russian military by creating a table of ranks, which means that people are going to be promoted based on how good they are at their job, not based on who their parents are. We call this a meritocracy, and Peter brought it to Russia. Fancy new army and navy, he defeats Sweden in the Great Northern War, which officially declares Russia a contender on the European stage. Tax and trade reforms in Russia expand the treasury six-fold in 50 years. He recognizes the importance of education, and Peter I establishes the Russian Academy of Sciences and also requires the boyars, the nobility in Russia, to send their kids to Western Europe to be educated. Now you might be thinking, Emily, all of those things are so good. Of course, Peter I deserves to be called the Great. Well, just think about that's also because we are in the West, so we kind of like Western things. But in his change, his total change of Russian society, he dismantles traditional Russian or Slavic customs and traditions. In forcing the nobles to dress like Western Europeans, he removes the Slavic culture of the bearskin capes and the furry hats. In building St. Petersburg, he drains a swamp and then leads to the deaths of hundreds of people, and then also forces peasants to do all the work for him. And if you have not heard about the beard tax, just ask your teacher. The CED, the course exam description, wants me to throw in the fact right here that Catherine the Great, Catherine II of Russia, continues this westernization. So I'm going to tell you that now, but then we'll put a pin in that because we're going to get to her way later in the course. If you need some help comparing and contrasting absolute monarchs, make sure that you check out my ultimate review packet linked in the description below, because I have everything that you need for skills practice or for learning practice, or just to succeed in the AP class and on your AP test. And students, as always, you can do it. I believe in you.